Of John. We're going to be in John chapter 2. We're going to be looking at, again, a rather familiar story for many of us. It's Jesus cleansing out the temple, as we see here in the second half of the second chapter of John. If you've been with us for some time, you know we started a series. We've called this Signs from God. And as Jesus begins to essentially make a nuisance of himself, if I can say it like that, he will validate his ministry, his claims through several signs that are recorded in this gospel. But here we look at a specific action that he makes in cleansing of the temple, which would have been highly, highly disruptive and controversial in his day. Well, life is full of upgrades, especially during the Christmas holiday. It seems like we're inundated with different things that we can upgrade, whether it be our smartphones, maybe it's your car. Maybe this year you bought a house and that was an upgrade from a place you were living before. Maybe you made some upgrades in your house. A new water heater. I speak from experience there, rather expensive experience, but such things like that, we are familiar with upgrades. Well, you may not be really aware of this, and it may not be in your public, conscious psyche today as a culture, but about 40 years ago, there was a very, very significant upgrade which was announced by the late Steve Jobs. I have a picture of it up here. It is the original Macintosh. There he is, Steve Jobs, the original Macintosh. Can I just see a show of hands real fast? Who had one of these machines? Yeah, okay, cool. So I'm just going to read to you what the website Mac Rumors has to say about looking back at this event. I'm sure you go visit macrumors.com all the time, but just for the sake of showing you I'm not plagiarizing, I'm going to read straight from what their website has to say. On January 24th, 1984, former Apple CEO Steve Jobs introduced the first Macintosh at Apple's annual shareholders meeting in Cupertino, California. Debuting the computer equipped with a 9-inch black and white display. Get these specs, they're very important. An 8 megahertz Motorola 6800 processor, a paltry 128 kilobytes of RAM, a 3.5-inch floppy drive. Parents, inform your kids later what a floppy drive is. Can't find them anymore. And a whopping price tag of about $2,500. So just so you know, in today's currency, that would be a little over $6,000, maybe about $6,500 with inflation. A rather expensive device. The now iconic machine weighed in at 17 pounds and was advertised as offering a word processing program, a graphics package, and a mouse. Just seems so benign now, right? So ordinary. At the time it was introduced, the Macintosh was seen as Apple's last chance to overcome IBM's domination of the personal computer market and remain a major player in the personal computer industry. And you can actually go on YouTube and you can search for this event. It's actually really interesting. It's about a 5-minute video of Jobs looking much younger than he did, than he passed away, of course, not too long ago, taking this computer out of his black bag and kind of plugging it in. And when he did so, he loaded a disk into it, and he said, well, I'm going to let the computer introduce itself. And so in a really, highly technical computer robot voice, which I won't emulate for you this morning, this is what the original Macintosh said. Hello, I'm Macintosh. Sure is great to get out of that bag. Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking, I'd like to share with you a maxim I thought of the first time I met an IBM mainframe. Never trust a computer you can't lift. Obviously, I can talk, but right now I'd like to sit back and listen. So it is with considerable pride that I introduce a man who's been like a father to me, Steve Jobs. So it actually sold really well. And one of the things that made me think about this, there's an iconic Super Bowl ad in 1984. Again, you might remember this. It's kind of part of the 1984 motif. And it famously aired during, I can't remember what Super Bowl that was, in 1984. And it kind of spawned an advertising campaign and led to the sales, I believe, of about 70,000 of these machines. And the reason why I say all this, and just use this as an illustration for us this morning, it was a significant upgrade to the computer industry. Before then, there were IBM computers. You could get a personal computer, but they were really clunky. Most of the time, they were, something that you would have at work. You wouldn't necessarily want one of these at home. You had to have some, basic programming language, like remember MS-DOS and the command prompts. Kids, you don't know what I'm talking about. But Steve Jobs introduced, the graphic user interface with the mouse, and it was revolutionary, and it was a significant upgrade to the computer industry. Now, why do I say all this and spend some time talking about this as an illustration? Well, we are familiar with upgrades. We live with them, we understand them. Oftentimes we find something and we say, I can't imagine life being lived without that. And over time, what becomes kind of just ubiquitous in our life and our lifestyle, we can't think of living life apart from things like a smartphone or a vehicle or high definition television. All those were significant upgrades at one point in time. And in this story, Jesus is going to say, I'm not just the upgrade to the temple, but I am the upgrade of the presence of God. I am the permanent upgrade. He calls his body the temple. And it would have been something that was inevitably lost on their ears. They had no idea what Jesus was talking about in this story. But what Jesus effectively is saying is that if you want to meet now in the presence of God, no longer do you come to a geographical temple, but you come to me. And you meet with God through me. It would have been revolutionary in Jesus' day to say such a thing. It is impossible for us to overstate the importance of the temple construct in the Jewish way of thinking in life. It's just impossible for us to overstate this. Of course, the original location of the presence of God was the tabernacle constructed by Moses, patterned to him by God himself when Moses was up on the mountain of Mount Sinai. And then they constructed the place of God and the place of his presence called the tabernacle. And that served the people of Israel pretty well for about 5 or 6 centuries, believe it or not. And it was David, King David, that wanted to upgrade the temple, and eventually that gave way to him leaving kind of all of these resources and a mission to his son Solomon. And Solomon was the one that constructed the temple, and it was a glamorous, glorious facility, and it was the place where God's presence dwelt in the Holy of Holy Places. And once a year, the high priest would go in and make atonement for the sins of the nation in accordance to the law. And it was there that God's presence dwelled with the people. But if you know your Old Testament history, you know that didn't go so well for the people. For about 5 centuries later, the Babylonians came in and utterly devastated and destroyed Solomon's temple. And it was laid bare, literally taken down and razed to the very foundations. Now, prior to that, Ezekiel tells us that the very presence of God left the temple. So it was really an empty shell of a structure by the time the Babylonians came in. But for 70 years, all we had was a foundation. And then when 70 years came through after that, there were exiles that came and returned back to Jerusalem and began to rebuild the temple. And it was nothing like its former glory. In fact, those that were alive in the time of the exile who would return were actually weeping because they saw the temple being built. And it was a poor replica or copy of what was from what Solomon had constructed. Now, if you know your biblical history, you know that building served the Jewish people for some time until we meet a guy named King Herod. And Herod was a half-Jew. He was looking for ways to, glamorize his own reign and make a name for himself. He was also looking for a way to pacify the Jewish people. So brick by brick, he began to upgrade the post-exile temple. And it was this monstrosity of a complex by the time Jesus visits it in this story. And it had become overly commercialized, and it had become really in many ways a shell of what it was formerly in David and in the tabernacle, though it was much bigger and much more glamorous. And it was an imposing structure. It really had nothing in line with what it once was. And so when Jesus enters into the temple precinct here in John chapter 2, he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it. Of course, he's referring, as we'll see, to his own body, effectively making a statement that this construct is now obsolete, and I am giving you and bringing you a permanent upgrade, the very presence of God in his body. We have seen his glory, glory as of the only begotten Son of God. We have beheld his glory, and it has dwelled among us, John tells us in John 1:14. Quite literally, the glory of God has tabernacled among us. Jesus makes indeed that claim. And so what I want you to see this morning, you might be saying, well, that's interesting biblical history. What does that have to do with me today? And I have great news for you. If you want to enjoy the presence of God, if you want to enjoy a reconciled, restored, redeemed relationship with God, you don't go to a physical location, you go to Jesus. And it is through Jesus and Jesus alone in which we have restoration and a reconciled relationship with God, which is permanent, never to be changed. Ultimately because of Christ. Let me just introduce the context just for a second here, and then we'll get to chapter 2, verse 12 in just a second. But in the next 10 chapters, and Jesus really started this at the wedding of Cana, he is seemingly turning the Jewish traditions and Jewish sensibilities and understanding of religion, turning it inside out. We saw at the wedding of Cana that he took 6 jars that were intended for the rite of Jewish purification. Jesus filled those, turned those into wine, symbolic of the joy and the restoration of his presence, which he brings. Here he goes to the temple. He's going to turn it inside out with the rabbinical teaching, as we'll see later. He's going to turn it inside out with him claiming to be the Lord of the Sabbath. He's going to reverse and kind of turn inside out the festival of Passover. He's going to do all of these things. He's going to be a major disruption. And that's ultimately going to be one of the reasons which leads to his execution. But let's finally read the story here together in verse 12 of chapter 2. We see here that Jesus is angry. Verse 12, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away, and do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Kind of walking through this again and looking at verse 12 again, we see that Jesus is in Capernaum, which would have been near the Sea of Galilee, and presumably he has maybe 5 disciples that he's called to this point. This is just after the wedding feast of Cana and the miracle. We don't know how long it takes in the interval of time between the miracle at Cana and the clearing of the temple as it's recorded here, but we get the sense that there's some time. And Jesus is with his mother, who was with him, of course, at the wedding feast, and he's also with his brothers. And I'll just say this right here. If you're familiar with Roman Catholic tradition believes in what's called the perpetual virginity of Mary. And it runs contradictory to such passages like this, where we are encountered with Jesus' half-brothers. And the word brothers here is often in Roman Catholic tradition translated and interpreted as cousins, but that would really be in many ways really incorrect. I don't know how else to say that, in accordance to the normal, usual way. In fact, there's no examples of this particular Greek word ever being translated as cousins that I'm familiar with, at least. And so Jesus here has his brothers. Now, his brothers will enter into the story again in chapter 7, but his brothers doubt Jesus. And so I'll just kind of say this as a point of application, tangential to much of what I have to say. You may find yourself in a family today that doubts your conversion experience or doubts your salvation or says, "Are you really, a Christ follower?" And it's because your family members know you so well. Jesus' brothers really had a real problem with who Jesus was and who he was claiming to be. They thought he was absolutely crazy. And it wasn't until after his resurrection that one of his brothers, half-brothers, James, came to faith in Christ. So there's an interesting parallel there in a story that I want to bring. But the other thing that we really have to deal with in this passage is, and if you're familiar with Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of the story of Jesus, you know that Jesus clears the temple at the end of his ministry. And here, John places the temple clearing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And so you might be wondering and asking yourself, well, which is the right account? And so you have several options here. One of the options would be, well, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record for their purposes Jesus' clearing of the temple at the end of his ministry. And so John gets the order, quote unquote, correct. The other option would be, well, it actually happened at the end of Jesus' ministry, and John, for his own rhetorical purposes, puts the temple clearing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Both of those are valid, and I would say, at least for our 21st century sensibilities, that kind of runs contradictory to the way we often think of history. We think of things very chronological. In the first century, they weren't quite as tied to the chronological accounts. But I think there's another option, and I actually think this is a better option. I think there were actually potentially two temple cleansings from Jesus. Jesus here is being recorded to cleanse the temple at the beginning of his ministry. He may have done it at the end of his ministry as well. And so perhaps these function as two bookends to help us understand who Jesus is. Regardless of how we solve that issue in understanding the biblical text, we need to understand the big point that this is making, and that Jesus is saying, effectively, I am the new place of God. I am the new place where you will meet with God. And so the scene here, as you can see, indeed angers Jesus. Now, Jesus would have been in Jerusalem many times up to this point. He would have visited Jerusalem during the festival of Passover, for example, as he is here. And he would have undoubtedly seen the scene before him, and it probably just irked him and just ate him up. Because of what was happening in the temple precincts. Now, it's very likely that the scene here that John depicts is in what's called the court of Gentiles. It was a place, literally the outer court, and you could be a woman, you could be a Gentile, you could go and visit the temple there in that court. And so because of that, it was a very convenient place to set up these tables for money changing and animal sacrifice. And so it wasn't necessarily bad what these people were doing to sell animals for the purpose of sacrifice and to exchange money for the purpose of the temple tax. What drove Jesus absolutely crazy was the location in which they chose to do it. And so what you need to understand is that when people would come on these festivals, they would have to give sacrifice. And so it was, pretty complicated or just inconvenient to bring animals with you. So they would procure these in Jerusalem and then offer them for the sacrifice. And they knew that these were kind of the kosher animals, right? These were the ones that were able to be spotless and to be sacrificed. And so those that were selling the animals, because they were offering that convenience, kind of marked it up a little bit and offered them a convenience charge. And it was there in the temple the temple in the court of the Gentiles that Jesus saw this. The other thing that they were doing is they were exchanging money. And so people would come and they would pay their temple tax, but they couldn't use the Roman currency for several reasons. One, it was had the depiction of Caesar's face on it, and so that wasn't kosher for the Jewish people. And also it needed to be backed with silver, which much of the Roman currency wasn't at that time, or it was being in many ways compromised. And so you would have money changers, just much like you would have a currency exchange at an airport, exchange the currency so that could be offered in the temple at the tax. And they would offer a little bit of an upcharge because it's a convenience charge, much like Citibank does for you when you go travel overseas today, right? We're familiar with these kinds of things, but the problem is where they are located. And so what is driving Jesus' anger here is he understands that the very presence of God in the temple is being compromised, it's being monetized, it's being commercialized. Jesus reacts to this. And in many ways, it is because of their stubborn pride and arrogance and entitlement that they feel like they can do this. That they say, no, this is our right as children of Abraham. And also what they're doing is they're taking the presence of God and they're demeaning it and belittling it and taking it for granted. And so what does Jesus do? He goes and he fashions a whip. I love this part of the story. Some of you I probably have seen driving behind you, whether you realize it or not, suffer from road rage. I'm just kidding, okay? But we all know when we have a moment on the road and you get cut off, there's something inside of us that wants to impulsively act, right? And we read stories, like really bad stories of road rage where people take out their Glocks and they take out, they wreck the car in front of them. Or I read the story, just kind of thinking about this yesterday, in 2013 in New York City, where one of these bicycle, groups, motorcycle groups somehow kind of made a dent in this guy's car. And so he reacted, ran over 3 of them, and then they have this high-speed chase. And one of them on the motorcycle was an off-duty police officer. It was incredibly well-known in the news and publicized. And we read about things like that. And so without knowing better, we might approach this story and think that maybe Jesus is reacting out of rage. Of course, that's not the case. Jesus has been seeing this for some time now through the years. And he goes and he fashions and shapes a whip. And he drives out the animals, and he flips over tables, and you can hear the jingling of the change and the money in the temple courts there. Jesus makes himself an absolute nuisance. But he does it because he's calculated. He doesn't react like I or you might react in rage. He does it, and it's almost like a volcano that is suppressed, and at the appointed time, God's wrath in the same way will erupt catastrophically. But don't complicate this and don't miss this, that Jesus' love in many ways is like a perpetual geyser that overflows. It is regular, it is rhythmic. But here his anger is calculated, and he comes and he visits the temple. And his disciples remember from Psalm 69, verse 9, a psalm of David, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Now, as we go in the story, look with me in verse 18. We have an assertion of Jesus. Of course, the religious authorities are like, "What in the world are you doing?" And so the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this Herodian temple," just to use that and interject that, "and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. It's really interesting as we kind of think about just the flow of this and how John shapes this for us. The Jewish authorities, are certainly caught off guard, and they're saying, "What in the world's happening?" This is quite the disruption to our little sanitized Passover, money-changing market we've got here. And so Jesus is making, a public spectacle, and they say, "Well, give us a sign for the authority in which you do this." Now, again, if you've been paying attention in this gospel so far, the word sign is a very, very important word in the Gospel of John. And when he changed the water into wine, that was the first of his signs. He will have a second sign at the end of chapter 4, actually in Cana of Galilee as well. And so they're saying, "Hey, give us a sign." And Jesus says, "I'm not going to do anything for you except for one thing. It's the capital S, the big sign that is yet to come. If you destroy this temple, I will raise it up again in 3 days." And they think he's absolutely out of his mind, because building projects in the ancient world took decades, as they say, 46 years to be exact. And Herod is still ongoing in building this thing. And so you're going to tear this down, Jesus, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days. You are out of your mind. Of course, Jesus is turning them inside out, and he says, "I'm talking about my body." And so this temple that you are so proud of, it is ultimately going to be and is now obsolete, because the presence of God is now dwelling, Jesus says, in my body. For the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. And it wasn't until, John says, at the resurrection of Jesus that the disciples looked back and thought back to this account and understood 100% with clarity this is exactly what Jesus was talking about. And so Jesus here is helping us to see that he indeed is the presence of God. He is the upgrade. But there's also some other threads that are being planted, if you will, that will kind of unravel in this story of the Gospel of John as we go forward. And that is this tension that is starting to begin to manifest itself of Jesus with the religious authorities. And the reason why is because the religious authorities could not, for the life of them, understand and bring themselves to understand what was or who was in their presence. They were so tied to their religious festivals and their religious duties that they forsook and could not see that the very means of redemption and reconciliation was staring at them right in the face through the eyes of God himself in the flesh. They couldn't see it. They were so tied to their history and so tied to their festivals, and they were so tied to their religious duties, they couldn't see the very miracle of God among them. And so as this story comes to a conclusion, we have this enigmatic text here that we'll spend some time here and kind of just, I think it links a lot of this together and helps us understand what John's purposes are. John 2:23, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs. We aren't told what they are, so for the purpose of the narrative, John doesn't tell us what they are, but Jesus is doing some sort of signs, miracles that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and decided and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. This is one of those passages or parts of Scripture that I think is so clearly in support of what's called the doctrine of total depravity. And so the doctrine of total depravity, you might be familiar with this expression. I think I've said it before. It doesn't mean that we are as bad as we can be, but it certainly means that we are as bad off as we can be. And Jesus does not entrust himself to the people there, specifically, probably very likely the Jewish authorities, because he knew what was inside their hearts. But he also knew what was universally inside of every single heart, of every single person who has ever walked the face of the earth, including myself and you. Something broken, something inside of us that the Bible calls very matter-of-factly sin. Sin is the rebellion of human beings to the authority of God in their lives. Several definitions that people have offered for sin. Wayne Grudem has said this: sin is any failure to conform to the moral law of God in act, sinful attitude, and nature. One theologian, Don Carson, says sin is very succinctly rebellion against God's very being. Paul, for his part, says in Romans 3:23, for all have sinned, and in conclusion, fallen short of the glory of God. Sin is universal, and so often we focus on sinful acts and sins, but we need to understand that the biblical witness is often more concerned with sin, what's lurking inside of the human heart. It is the inward, intentional, oftentimes belligerent rebellion of human beings against God, their creator, and it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Did God really say? God is hiding something from us. His goodness is being withheld from us. So therefore, I have to take matters in my own hands so that I might be equal with God or even place God underneath me. And so when Adam and Eve took of the fruit, in effect, what they were saying is, I want to be God. And for every human being ever since, we have fallen prey to that simple lie of, I want authority and I want it now. Effectively, if we can just summarize it, what Jesus is really coming to discern and see in people's hearts is the evil pride that lurks within. This week I've been reading a book called Born Again by Chuck Colson. You probably know that name, Charles Colson. He was the special advisor during the Nixon administration. He was eventually indicted under the Watergate charges and eventually served time in prison, but it's a really fascinating book because before he was indicted, he was actually converted to Christianity. and he met a friend of his that actually told him about his faith in Jesus, and Colson didn't have any idea of what this was. So finally, he couldn't get it out of his head, so he drives over to his friend's house, and his friend hands him a copy of the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And I want to read this because this is in accordance to Lewis being quoted as well as Colson in his own words, because I think it really resonates deeply with what Jesus is saying here. There is one vice of which no man in the world is free, this is C.S. Lewis, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees in it someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. I have heard people admit that they are bad-tempered, or that they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they are cowards. I do not think that I have ever heard anyone who is not a Christian accuse himself of this vice. There is no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The vice I am speaking of is pride or self-conceit. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. And Colson says, as he read, his friend read, I could feel a flush coming into my face and a curious burning sensation that made the night seem even warmer. Lewis's words seemed to pound straight at me. And so if I can land the plane here and just have us think about this before we take the Lord's Supper, the problem that Jesus recognizes there in the temple precinct that day is a universal condition and problem that every single one of us shares, and it is pride in our position, pride in our inheritance, pride in our religious duties, pride in our exercise of ambition so that we might directly overcome God in our lives, and through the observation and the taking for granted the very place of God in our lives that Jesus is reacting against, and he's saying, you people are broken. Because you're broken because of what's inside of you and your pride that lurks deep, and you can't even see it. And Jesus says, I'm coming to correct it. In the very presence of God, in the grace of God, in the redemption of God through his body, which is going to be broken for us and blood shed for us because of our stubborn, arrogant pride, Jesus says, I'm laying down my life for that, so that you might become, as John says, John 1:12, a child of God. Not through your religious exercises and your duties and your position, but because of grace. Jesus says that, and they completely miss it. Let me conclude here before we take the Lord's Supper together in the book of Hebrews. Turn with me, if you will, to the book of Hebrews chapter 10. And there is an imperative that's connected here specifically to this. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near.